Welcome back to a very special episode of Road to Gojira. Why is it so special? Because at last we'll be delving into some Japanese monster flicks, or kaiju movies as some may refer to them. But before doing that, we need to look into that very interesting word I just used called kaiju. You've heard me use it quite a bit on this channel. But what does that word even mean? Well, if you know anything about nerd culture, you know it's the Japanese word for giant monster. And you'd be right. So let's move on to other kaiju movies that predate Godzilla. Oh, if only it were that simple. Alright, now let's take a step back and examine that word a little more carefully. While the term kaiju does denote a monster, it also has some extra significance, so much so that its meaning has gradually altered over time. So let's begin with the basics first. Although the word's exact origins are unknown, the Shenhaijing, a well-known piece of Chinese literature that covers a variety of mythological landscapes and monsters, appears to be where the term kaiju first appeared. Later, the Japanese would use this name to refer to their own mythical beasts, up until Toho Studios' 1954 release of the film Gojira. Following Gojira, Toho and other film studios released a growing number of kaiju films in the years that followed. Toho even makes them to this day, all pointing back to Gojira, who many consider to be the kaiju genre's genesis. Is that latter statement true? We'll find out in due time. But first, what even is a kaiju? The word kaiju is a combination of the Japanese terms kai, which means mystery or unknown, and ju, which means beast. Hence the word kaiju, which means mysterious beast. Japan utilizes several writing systems, of which the logographic kanji is the one under examination here. Sometimes kanji can have more than one meaning, and kaiju certainly meets that criteria. While the mysterious beast title is a literal translation of the word kaiju, the word sometimes can be translated as monster. However, the Japanese already have a word to describe monster, kaibutsu. This word can even be heard in some kaiju films. Now, even though there is a word for monster in the Japanese language, kaiju seems to have eclipsed it when describing the majority of creatures, at least when it comes to defining the monsters in Godzilla and various tokusatsu productions. Now, before I continue going over the word kaiju, I want to step back real fast and quickly go over another word I used here, that being tokusatsu. Tokusatsu is commonly translated as special effects filming, and is often associated with Japanese productions that rely on special effects to help tell their narratives. The tokusatsu filming style has been applied to many Japanese films and TV shows over the years, but the term is most commonly associated with kaiju pictures, as those are typically effects-heavy productions. And of course, there's the Japanese superhero television shows, such as Ultraman, Kamen Rider, and Super Sentai, just to name the popular ones. And as everyone and their grandmother knows, the Super Sentai series was altered when it was brought to the West, particularly starting with Zyuranger, which became Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which in itself began its own franchise. And ever since all these series began, new entries have been released, even to this day. Speaking of the West, when did the word kaiju become more well known outside of Japan? That can be a bit tricky to answer, but our traces can go back to the biggest monster of them all, the internet, which has undoubtedly aided with that in certain ways. Since everyone utilizes the internet these days for many purposes, I'm sure that Godzilla enthusiasts like myself have come across the term numerous times while researching Godzilla-related subjects. Yet I believe the movie Pacific Rim was the one that actually spread the word to a much larger audience. Unlike the Godzilla movies, which often translated the word kaiju to mean monster, Pacific Rim maintains the original word and even explains its meaning so that audiences can understand what a kaiju is. Interestingly, the film defines kaiju as giant beasts, and with the film generating over $400 million at the box office, I'd assume that a lot of people saw it and associated the word to infer that kaiju are creatures of enormous size. While the word kaiju can be used to describe a monster regardless of height, there is a phrase reserved for enormous creatures, daikaiju, which translates to great strange beast. Although it is used occasionally, most people just equate the word kaiju with giant monsters. Even my favorite card game Yu-Gi-Oh has a kaiju themed archetype, featuring gigantic creatures based on popular kaiju series. And these cards are simply referred to as kaiju, even in Japanese. So it really doesn't matter if you call Godzilla a kaiju or a daikaiju. While the latter might be the more appropriate word to employ, the former is equally acceptable. Now that the term has been appropriately defined, we are free to move on to our next query. Can any monster be considered a kaiju? Short answer is yes. Though, like the word itself, the question is not really as simple as that. So what can and cannot count as a kaiju? Well, that really all depends on who you're asking. You see, in the beginning, there really was no set rules on what kaiju are. There was no mastermind behind the concept, there was no Bible made to establish rules. As I mentioned before, most people today choose to use the word kaiju instead of daikaiju when talking about a gigantic sized creature. The whole genre became established to how it is today because of the fan base and the people who continue to make these types of stories throughout the decades since the original Gojira. One example of a film that wasn't meant to be a kaiju movie, but is ultimately viewed as one by people today, is the 1921 animated picture The Pet, which was based on Winsor McCay's comic strip Dream of a Rarebit Fiend. In the comic itself, there's a canine-like creature that grows to enormous proportions. The owner tries to put it to rest by a variety of cruel ways, but is unable to do so. The animated version uses the same notion of a strange beast gradually growing in size. The story starts off innocent, but slowly gets more dark as the film progresses. The comic simply shows the creature growing to the height of what appears to be the equivalent of a 3-story house. The animated version takes the monster's height to the extreme, with the beast dwarfing skyscrapers. The story even depicts an aerial attack on the beast in the movie's climax, which is something that would appear in numerous other Japanese monster pictures to come. Even King Kong ended with an aerial assault. The interesting thing about that is that none of these things existed yet. The plot's creators were not riffing on kaiju movies because the genre did not exist yet. They simply told a story that happened to involve a giant monster, and as a result, the film is now regarded as a pioneer in the kaiju genre. It was informally dubbed as a kaiju film because enthusiasts of the genre saw it that way. I'm not saying everyone thinks like that, but a majority of the fan base does. Nowadays, the term kaiju is used quite loosely. Given how broadly defined it is now, any giant creature can now be considered a kaiju. But is there a method to distinguish genuine kaiju like Gamera and Godzilla from Clifford the Big Red Dog? Again, it just depends on who you're asking. People have come forth to help divide a line on what kind of beasts can be considered kaiju and what ones can't. Some claim that the creatures must be from Japan, while others argue that they must possess frightening attributes. The most common requirement I've noticed is that the monsters must exhibit characteristics beyond their typical animalistic traits. That last one usually helps set kaiju apart from their enormous Western counterparts, who typically behave like untamed animals. It's a good way to separate them, but the Japanese even consider non-Japan creatures as kaiju, as seen in the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms Japanese title, which was renamed The Atomic Kaiju Appears. So does that mean that creature counts as a kaiju? Well, if so, doesn't King Kong count as a kaiju? Some say no, but those same individuals call the Toho Kongs kaiju, but not the other incarnations. Is the TriStar Godzilla a kaiju? And if not, how come Zilla from Final Wars is? Should this whole conundrum spawn headaches? It seriously shouldn't. In the end, kaiju can really just be whatever the storytellers need them to be. The word in its original context has come a long way, and even today still gets its meaning changed. Defining the genre can be difficult, and I don't want to linger on it any more than I already have. There is more to explore on this topic, but for the time being, I'd like to bookmark myself on it and return to a question I posed earlier. Is Godzilla the original kaiju who began the entire genre? Based on what we've already discussed, the answer may be straightforward or may need further investigation. The former can respond to our question with ease: no. Just going off the original meaning of the word kaiju gives us way too many strange beasts that existed long before Godzilla. Even creatures with a great scale of size lap him in age. Nevertheless, when considering the phrase in its contemporary use, Godzilla is a unique example of the genre. As previously stated, many more kaiju-related films were produced immediately following Godzilla's release.
If you wait 40 years, you might be able to see it in America too.
Why's that?
2004 will be Godzilla's 50th birthday.
You think they're still going to be making Godzilla movies then?
Of course! Everybody loves Godzilla.
The original Godzilla picture had a significant impact on tokusatsu filmmaking. Sure, it may have reproduced some effects from previous films, but it used them in its own way. The modern definition of kaiju as we see it today is looked at as enormous beasts. Of course owing largely to Pacific Rim, but Pacific Rim owes a lot to Godzilla, and many other giants that followed in Godzilla's wake. Therefore, I can state with certainty that Godzilla can be seen as the original kaiju that began the genre into what it is today. That being said, there are other Japanese movie monsters that came way before Gojira, and I'd like to go over a number of them to see what Japanese kaiju films were like without Gojira's influence. Our journey begins to the distant past of 1921 with the film Jiraiya the Brave, based on the Japanese folktale Jiraiya Gogetsu Monogatari. I will say this right away, this is by no means a monster movie. In fact, I really can't tell you much about the plot because it's a silent film with very little title cards. It's likely the picture is counting on your familiarity with the source material, or it's possible that the version I saw wasn't the whole film. The issue with many of these Japanese films before World War II is that they are either hard to find, or are simply lost films that were either destroyed in the war, or perhaps by something else that transpired in their disappearance. Thankfully, that doesn't seem to be the case with this movie, which does employ some tokusatsu-style creatures, which in this movie are transformations of huge animals employed by certain characters. Our hero Jiraiya can occasionally change into a gigantic toad that can swallow people, Orochimaru who can change into a monstrous serpent, and Tsunade who uses magic to change into an enormous slug. If you're familiar with a certain manga series, then these names and particular animals should sound very familiar to you. As I already stated, Jiraiya the Brave is by no means a monster movie, because the transformations are utilized very infrequently. But even so, this is one of the first instances of tokusatsu-style monster suits and puppet work used in Japanese cinema. The 1938 film The Three Invincible Swordsmen is another bizarre film that features swordsmen alongside monsters, in this case, robots, fighting each other during the Edo period. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information available on this one. All I got was that the film in its completed state is now lost with only 4 minutes of footage remaining. Footage it seems the internet does not have, or at least I couldn't find it. The next movie I want to look at is The Adventures of Tobisuke, released in 1949, featuring a plethora of bizarre-looking creatures, including huge onis, who some may argue were the first giant monsters in Japanese cinema. Unlike the majority of the films on this list, this movie can be watched, however it's only available in Japan on DVD right now. I'm really curious about this one, so maybe one day I can dig into it some more when I have a better option to actually view it. Japan had a few human-sized monster pictures like The Invisible Man Appears and Iron Claws, movies I'd like to go over another time. The next movie is titled Ramayana, a marionette-style film based on a Hindu mythology also known as Ramayana. Now, I'm not going to pretend like I know anything about the source material, so before seeing this movie, I looked up the original Hindu narrative to get a sense of the concept. The film is a silent picture with no speech cards, yet the tale is quite simple to comprehend. A monstrous being abducts a girl named Sita, and our hero Rama, in an army of flying monkeys, must rescue her. It's a somewhat comical picture at moments, and the action leaves a lot to the imagination. It's a movie still worth seeing in my opinion. The movie has a lot of mystery surrounding it, but that's something we can explore another time. Let's talk King Kong. I know, here I am again talking about King Kong. By this point I might as well rename this series Road of Kong. Joking aside, you have to recognize that King Kong was extremely popular at the time, and the character will continue to contribute to the Godzilla franchise, as we'll see later. A few months after its premiere in the United States, King Kong was brought to Japan, and just like it was in America, it was a huge hit in Japan as well. In fact, the film was so successful that it gave rise to the film Wasei Kingu Kongu, a production exclusive to Japan. Wasei Kingu Kongu literally translates as Japanese King Kong. And you'd be mistaken to believe that this is just the original King Kong tale remade in Japan. The story revolves around a vagabond who is unable to date a girl because her father forbids her from dating a homeless man. Thus, upon witnessing the success of the film King Kong in Japan, the vagrant decides to become a showbiz star and portray King Kong in a vaudeville theater, in order to win Daddy's approval and get some nice cash while he's at it. As the summary makes clear, the picture does not even include a kaiju. Instead, it is a man dressed up like one who towers over miniatures and performs stage plays. What's noteworthy about this is that it might be the first Japanese film to do so before a genre was created using this method, minus the stage show. We are sadly left with no way to view this movie other than with a few surviving images, because it is another one of those films that has been lost to the passage of time. It's also amusing to think that this film was released in 1933, meaning that there was 3 different Kong movies released in 1 year. Japan would give the Big Ape another go-around in cinema, this time in 1938, with a 2-part film titled The King Kong That Appeared in Edo. Unlike the last film we viewed, this one actually does feature a strange beast, instead of a man acting in a suit. Well, at least in terms of the story. Anyway, this is a rather interesting little tidbit in King Kong's history, as we'll soon find out. The film's story revolves around Chinami, a kidnapped girl whose father is offering a financial award to anyone who finds her. The guy who abducted Chinami is among those who learn about the prize money, kidnapping her by way of his father's pet kaiju, King Kong. Yes, it appears that some guy keeps a massive ape as a pet. Anyway, the abduction has a fairly intricate motive. We find out that the abductor wants to exact revenge on Chinami's father for forcing the abductor's father to attempt currency counterfeiting, but the father resisted to do so and ended up in prison. I'm going to say now that everything about this story sounds fascinating, but unfortunately we are dealing with yet another lost movie here. One that doesn't even have its whole summary preserved. To be honest, I have no idea if Kong in this movie was actually gigantic. Even the synopsis notes that the creature is not much taller than an ordinary person, despite the fact that the promotional material betrays him as such. However, various sources claim that the enormous ape was only used for advertising purposes, and that the monster in the movie is not as big as he looks on the promotional material. In spite of its name, the ape may not have even been referred to as King Kong. Aside from the moniker and the title, the beast has no real connection to the King Kong, and its appearance more closely resembles that of a yeti more so than an ape. In fact, websites such as Wikizilla even publish the beast without the King Kong title. The entirety of the film is really an odd little digression in King Kong's history, if it even qualifies as a King Kong movie at all. The final film I want to quickly look over is The Great Buddha Arrival from 1934. I already talked about this movie in detail a while back, so I'll be brief here. At Chorakun Park, the 33-meter tall Buddha statue that resides there comes to life and sets out on a mission to rescue humanity. The monument travels in the Shukyo area before setting off to Tokyo. Like the Kong movies we just discussed, The Great Buddha Arrival has now been lost from Japanese cinema history. Even though we are unable to watch the movie today, there are many interesting details about it, such as the film's desire to launch a franchise, it utilizing King Kong-like effects, and even the possibility of some sequences in color. Whether any of that is accurate or not is still up for debate. One fact for sure on that is that the man responsible for the movie was a well-respected filmmaker named Yoshiro Edamasa. Now, his name may not resonate with anyone today, but a name that you may have heard of is that of Eiji Tsuburaya, who was mentored by Edamasa, and practically got him into the film business. The Great Buddha Arrival is often regarded as the first kaiju film, but Tsuburaya's work on Gojira transformed the art of tokusatsu, spawning a genre that would inspire many more films in the future. Tsuburaya plays a very big role into the creation of Gojira, and we'll definitely look more into him at another time. For now, we're going to wrap up this special Road to Gojira episode. Of course, I hope you all look forward to the next episode, and until then, take care.